University of Technology in Brisbane and a visiting research fellow at the University of Huddersfield. Kieran's probably best known for his work on the origins and causes of sex offending and societal responses to sex offenders, including circles of support. And this year, he's also published on trauma-informed practice in criminal justice. There's a very, very good article. I'll put the links in the chat, actually, because it's freely available about that. And I really recommend it as a companion piece to this. And just to confirm, you will be sent the slides after the session. So over to you, Kieran.
Thank you, Kate, and good morning, everyone, and welcome. So the webinar is divided into 3 sections. So we're going to start off talking about ACEs and trauma, as well as their impact on development and life course criminology and psychology. The part 2 will be about the impact of trauma in the lives of people who have offended, and part 3 is how you use trauma-informed practice in the community integration of people who have offended. And the idea is that we should concentrate the conversations in these 3 20-minute parts so that people know what's happening, people know what's going on, and obviously people know that there's an end in sight, and I'm not just going to talk indefinitely for hours on end, which I have been known to do, so don't worry, that won't happen. So part 1, what are ACEs and trauma, and what is their impact on development and life course? And this is really important for us to start to get our head around, because generally speaking, when we think about adverse childhood experiences and trauma, we tend to think about maybe education, maybe social work, we tend to think about psychology and psychological responses, but actually these fit in to criminology, and criminology have been using these discussions for many years, but we've been using different words to discuss them and different words to think about them. And when you work across the criminal justice field, what you find is that quite often we use different words in different professions to mean the same thing, or sometimes we use the same word in different professions to mean different things. So it's important to sort of nail down some of the lexicon issues around this. So just to start off with, one of the most important things that we have to remember about crime and criminal justice and offending behavior is that it crosses the socio-ecological divide in society. We have to think about crime and offending behavior about being more than just one person doing a bad thing to other people or to society in general. We have to think about the individual, which means thinking about personality, biology, psychology. We also have to think about their relationships with other people and how they interact with friends and families and peer groups, as well as communities. People who commit offences come from communities and they go back into communities. And especially when we start to think about domestic violence, sexual violence, neglect, child abuse, a lot of these offences are committed by people known to the victim. So both relationships and communities matter. They're not abstract concepts. And society, how we as society characterise and construct and think about crime really matters. So there is a multi-level approach, and quite often in day-to-day working, we tend to focus on the individual, which is important, but we've got to remember the context in which that individual exists. As the old saying goes, no person is an island. So in recent years, criminology has always been what is referred to in academic literature as a rendezvous subject, which sounds very glamorous, but what it really means is it's not a discipline the same way sociology and psychology are. It's people from different disciplines coming together to think about a central topic, which in this instance is crime. We've been looking more towards public health as a way of understanding crime and criminal justice at both that individual and societal levels. And we have started to see the emerge mainly in the last 5 to 7 years around something called epidemiological criminology, which is really understanding how criminology and criminal justice and health come together. And if you sort of look at the diagram here, what you end up seeing is all the things that we looked at in that past slide. So individual, relationship, community, society get played out across the macro, meso, and structural levels within the epidemiological framework. And bringing together our understanding of crime and our understanding of public health and public health models is really important, because it allows us to look at crime and criminal justice from a different perspective. We start to look at it as a life course issue, which then means that crime and offending behavior develops across people's lifespan, which then gives us a longer perspective to look at it, which enables us to think about prevention, which enables us to think about treatment, which enables us to think about intergenerational offending behaviors as well. So, as I've just sort of said, moving away from a criminal justice only approach to a more rounded approach really does a lot of groundwork for us. Because one of the issues that we have in criminal justice is we tend to pathologize and individualize, which means we tend to think of abhorrently deviant individuals who commit crimes and vulnerable victims who need safeguarding. And while that's important, it means that we miss the bigger picture. It means that we miss the multidisciplinary links, that we miss the opportunities for prevention, for knowledge transfer and generation. But it also means that we focus too much on after the fact. We become punitive in our responses, and not necessarily punitive as in, we're going to throw you in jail and take away the key, but as in react with punishment and react with intervention, rather than thinking about the whole field and everything that exists within it. So over the last few years, there has been a growing conceptualization, as I've indicated, of crime and criminal justice as public health issues. Now, quite a lot of you public health people out there will be aware of the 4 levels of prevention, and there are aspects of crime and criminal justice theory and practice which link to them, but some are more developed than others. And this becomes quite important, that if we think about not only crime and offending as an individual journey, but as a societal journey, that where the individual interacts with different groups and stages along the way, it becomes important to think about what prevention looks like in this gaze, because actually we can categorize a lot of the work that is done in criminal justice around the prevention framing. So primary prevention, which is preventing first time offending, or it can be preventing reoffending. And from a public health view, this is an action to prevent disease in people who feel well. And in a criminal justice frame, this is an action to prevent criminogenic or risky behavior in people who are not criminogenic and are risky. And you know, you've seen a lot of this sort of primary prevention stuff around COVID at the minute, you know, hands, space, face. And we see this as well, where in criminal justice, when we hear broad Ministry of Justice Home Office messages around this, when we look at, especially if you think about child sexual abuse and neglect, NSPCC and Bernardo messaging around this, making people aware of what the realities are and the impact of crime and criminal justice. So we do primary prevention in criminology and in criminal justice. It's not a new concept for us, but one of the emerging ones that we don't do a lot of is secondary prevention. So again, this is either preventing first-time offending or reoffending. And this is working with at-risk populations before they enter the criminal justice system. So in a public health phase, this is action to detect disease. at an early stage in people who feel well, or from a criminal justice perspective, a behavior at an early stage in people without a criminal conviction. And this is important. We have to start thinking about how we can work effectively with people who feel that they're at risk of committing an offence, or their friends, families, peers are starting to see behaviours in them that concern them and want to offer them advice. So this might be aspects of bystander intervention, but this might also be people at risk reaching out for treatment and support around this. So, for instance, you in the field of sexual offending, you have organisations like Safer Lives and Lucy Faithful Foundation, Stop So, who do work with people at risk of committing an offence. You see this in youth clubs and youth centres with juveniles at risk of committing offences as well. So we do work at this, but we need to do more work around this, because if we can prevent first time offending, we can stop people from entering the system, which means that we can work effectively with them to control and to facilitate their non-criminogenic lifestyles. Tertiary prevention is something we do a lot in criminal justice. So this is action to reduce symptoms and complications of disease in people who feel sick. So in a criminal justice frame, this is treatment and intervention. So this might be Kaizen or Horizon. This may be Good Lives model. This may be risk management, risk needs responsivity, stuff like that. So these are treatments and interventions that we give to people. They're generally cognitive behavioral in nature and generally person-centered. But we do a lot of this. Now, generally speaking, in criminal justice, we wouldn't frame this as prevention. We would frame this as a response. So it would be a response to sentencing or a response to incarceration or community management. And this is the version of public health that most people see within the context of criminal justice. And the last one is really emerging, and criminal justice and criminology have not, up until now, given a lot of time or thought or consideration around quaternary prevention. So this is an action taken to protect people from interventions that are likely to cause more harm than good. So it's over medicalization. So in medical terms, if you're on 7 different medications, your doctor will look at your medications and say, can we change some of these so we can reduce them and we can reduce the overcomplications? In criminal justice terms, this is reducing the impact of over-criminalization and over-punitiveness, because we know that as people move through an assistance pathway, they're more likely to succeed if they're supported on that journey and they feel enabled to turn their lives around. And we can see some aspects of this in things like circles of support and accountability. But this is not a treatment or an intervention. This is an ongoing support for people when released from prison or on community management that helps them reintegrate and feel part of society again as they move forward. It's that sort of safety net that allows behavior change to happen. So, as I've said up until now, primary and tertiary are easily identified and relatively well supported in terms of funding, public relations. They're the parts of the criminal justice system that people can see in a public health frame. Secondary is emerging, but it's challenging. Like, how do you secure funding for secondary when you can't necessarily indicate that the intervention that you're having is having an impact and it's what has reduced the likelihood of someone going on to commit an offence? Quaternary is not always necessarily well understood, but actually what you're maybe starting to see with the recalibration of the probation service and that movement back to that assist and befriend model that we had up until a number of years ago, that actually starting to think about supportive reintegration is a really helpful tool and mechanism within that. But there are different aspects within this. So quite often the criminal justice tertiary and quaternary are seen as the same process of treatment and reintegration, where actually they're two different processes. And us learning from public health about the differentiation between these pathways and models really helps us understand how we can best focus our resource. The other thing that becomes important in thinking about tertiary and quaternary is by doing productive and supportive work with people who have offended, it means we can better understand their offending trajectories and pathways so that we can build more effective primary and secondary prevention models that actually assist with intervention development that stops offending before it happens. And it also helps in the reintegration process, because the more people understand their drivers towards offending and their triggers, the more likely they are to be able to be rehabilitated or be able to manage their own risk moving forward. So how does this tie in? Well, this ties in to things around adverse childhood experiences and life course criminology. So we're going to focus a lot more on life course criminology in part 2, but this is just to flag some of these ACEs up. And it's really important that we understand that what these ACEs are, because we're actually able to map them onto some of the work that is done by leaders in developmental criminology like Farrington and West, and the Cambridge study, and stuff that's been done from the 70s ongoing that we've known about. These things really map together. So generally speaking, adverse childhood experiences are abuse, so physical, emotional, and sexual, neglect, physical and emotional, and household dysfunction, so mental illness, incarcerated relative, mother treated violently, substance abuse, and divorce. And why are these important? Because research has shown, both from the US and from the UK, and uh, although mainly northernized Western Hemisphere research, has shown the impact that ACEs have. Because what experiencing ACEs does is it rewires the brain. So ACEs impact your fight or flight tendency. So it makes you into a heightened state of arousal that then leads you to making challenging or risky or poorly thought through decisions. So if you think about when you are stressed and when you are at your most dysfunctional, you are not making the most effective decisions that you can possibly make. Now, the challenge around ACEs is people tend to think, oh, these are cumulative things. So the more ACEs that you have, the more problems that you have. And it doesn't necessarily work that way, because going back to our earlier slides at the beginning, we have to think about the individual as well. And individual biology is amazing. And individual biology means that some people have greater resilience than other people. Some people have less resilience than other people. The other side of the ACEs paradigm also is, if it rewires the brain, that means that once we're aware of it, we can dewire the complications, and we can work with people to reduce the impact of their ACEs. And so what are examples of childhood trauma? So the impact of childhood trauma affects cognition, physical health, emotions, relationships, mental health, behavior, and brain development. And what we see in this is behavior changes with the introduction of ACEs and trauma. So we can see a range of different behaviors, and sometimes they're obvious and sometimes they're not so obvious. So it's really about being attuned to what some of these ACEs and traumas are, how they're impacting people, and then thinking about that in terms of the different levels of prevention so we can think about how we stop offending behavior. Because the reality of offending damages a number of people, the person offending and the person impacted or persons impacted by the offending. And this is interesting because in the subgroup we had conversations around this, and certainly from a criminology perspective, ACEs are important, but they should be thought of as part of a wider display of trauma. So trauma can affect anyone at any point in their lives. And while ACEs may exist, and we will talk about this in part two, in people who have offended, you also have adults who have trauma and are impacted by trauma, which then changes their behavior and then changes the way that they engage and the way that they participate in society. So certainly a perspective that I would encourage us to think about within a criminal justice frame is to think about trauma being the overarching concept and adverse childhood experiences being a subsection within that. So they are important and they do play a role, but we can't say that only childhood trauma impacts criminogenic behavior in later life. So this is the end of part one. So in part one, we introduced some concepts around criminal justice, how it links to public health, how it links into prevention, and what the role of ACEs and trauma can be within this. So in part two, we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of trauma in the lives of people who have offended, both adult trauma and child trauma. So we're going to talk through some of the theories that this links to and some of the ways in which we can think about this, because as we'll get to the end, not trying to spoil the ending, you'll see that this leads us in one direction, which then allows us to think about trauma-informed practice in criminal justice in a quite clear and effective way. I'm just going to have a quick drink of water. So, part two. The role of trauma and adverse experiences, not only in childhood but in criminogenic behavior, is not new in criminology. We've been talking about this for decades. It's the core of developmental criminology. And developmental criminology argues that as people age, their exposure to and participation in criminogenic and antisocial behavior changes. And there's been really influential work done around this. So like people like David Farrington and West, the work around the Cambridge study, which charted the life course of a cohort from London, of youths from London, as a developmental life course study that's still going on at the minute, and looked at relationships, peers, so that individual relationship, community, society, and really got us thinking around it. Terry Moffitt did a lot of work around adolescent limited and life course persistence offenders. Because what we know from research is that the biggest bulk of offending is committed by youths, generally people between the ages of 16 and their mid to late 20s. Most people age out of crime, but like from a health perspective, so when you think about resources and you think about impact on GP surgeries, we know that a small population with complex comorbidity eats up a lot of time and resource. And it's the same in criminal justice. We know that a smaller group of medium and higher risk individuals eat up a lot more of our resources than the larger group of lower risk individuals. And what we see with crime is that people do age out of crime. So most people who commit crime have stable and dynamic risk factors. So the risk factors are factors that put them at risk of committing an offense, and we'll go into these in a little bit more detail in a minute. But generally speaking, we're looking at antisocial values, antisocial peers, personality traits, family dysfunction, low self-control, and substance abuse, which also includes alcohol abuse as well. And how does this fit in with some of the material that we've been talking about, ACEs and post-trauma as well? So research by Craig et al. In 2017 found that ACEs were found to increase the likelihood of offending throughout the life course. And this is something that we'll see in the Scottish and Welsh studies that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a minute. So the importance of the life course, as I've said, social, community, interrelationship, and individual factors all play a role in this. So what are risk and protective factors? Well, risk factors are factors that increase the likelihood that someone is going to commit an offense. And what are protective factors? So generally, they are factors used to protect someone so that they are less likely to commit an offense. So if you look at things like whether it's the Sure Start program, whether it's treatment and rehabilitation within prison or within the community, that actually a lot of these programs are designed to reduce protective factors. So skills for managing your behavior, skills for stabilizing your life and maybe getting a job, and maybe regulating your engagement with other people in a more effective way. So the more protective factors that people have, the less likely they are to commit an offense. And again, it's not a numeracy thing. You don't say, well, you've got 5 risk factors and 4 protective factors, so therefore you're more risky. The reality is a little bit like ACEs and trauma. It's what are those risk factors and what are those protective factors in the context of the individual and in the context of their wider circle and community as well. And we see this in a lot of third sector work around supporting people who have come out of prison and in probation, so that actually what pro-social modeling and what skills can be delivered with these individuals so that actually we can support their integration. So what does this have to do with ACEs? So if we're saying that ACEs runs parallel in a criminal justice frame to risk factors, so you think about those ACEs, they're very similar to a lot of the risk factors that we talk about in criminology and criminal justice. What this means is that if we know this from a health and from a criminal justice perspective, that ACEs and past trauma have an impact on people's development and their life course, it means that we can identify and intervene with them at an appropriate juncture. So in terms of ACEs and criminal justice, what we have seen in the Scottish study, so this is from the Scottish study that was done a few years ago. If you look at the links, so any links that you see in this presentation are active links, so you can just copy them into your browser and that will take you to the relevant site around it. So within the Scottish study, what we have ended up seeing is that people who have 4 or more ACEs are 20 times more likely to be incarcerated at some point in their lives. That's a massive amount. And what that speaks to is the fact that people who have ACEs and trauma and risk factors in their background are more likely to have been impacted by those, and therefore more likely to end up committing antisocial behavior and criminogenic behavior. Now, this isn't a given. We've got to always keep in mind that ACEs are not accumulative, but what we're saying is there's a warning sign here that maybe there's some way that we could intervene. So is there some way that we could do some secondary prevention with some of these groups and populations to prevent them from entering the criminal justice system? But it's not just in Scotland. We have found this in Wales. So this is the outcome of a Welsh study that was done on it. And we have found, well, not we, the Welsh study have found that those with 4 or more ACEs were 3.5 times more likely to be prolific offenders. The prisoners with 4 or more ACEs were 4 times more likely to have served a sentence in a young offender institution than those with no ACEs. We really need to say a similar work done in England and similar work done in Northern Ireland around this. And Scotland and Wales are really proactive in their ACEs work and their trauma work, where they actually think about it at a policy level. It is not simply, and here we go away and have a think about it in prison or in probation or in placing, that actually at a governmental policy level, ACEs are thought of in a criminal justice frame, which is really important, because what we see is that ACEs lead to a possible correlation with offending behavior. So it's a correlation, not a causation. So then we've got to really start thinking through, actually, how do we use this information to effectively make decisions that safeguard individuals who are at risk and safeguarding people who are vulnerable to offending behavior. So I'm just using one example from this. So when we think about people who have committed offences, there is a range of offences, and we see this across a lot of individuals, whether it's prolific low-level offending, whether it's high-risk antisocial offending. We see the role of development, and we see the role of ACEs and trauma within those individuals. So if you look at the work done by organizations like Revolving Doors, which talk about the impact of criminalizing low-risk individuals, and if you look at the role of social policy and socioeconomics within that, we also need to look at people convicted of a sexual offense, people convicted of domestic violence or interpersonal violence. So again, this is maybe a call for research and engagement around this, but certainly in the USA, a lot of work has been done around the role of ACEs and trauma in the past lives of people who have sexually offended. And we've got to be careful in generalizing things cross-culturally, because just because something is highlighted in the US or Canada or Australia or even in Europe doesn't mean it plays out in the same way in the UK, but it gives us pause for thought, and it gives us an opportunity to think things through. So what we end up seeing from the research done in the US is that actually people who commit sexual offences have ACEs in their background, and they have multiple ACEs in their background, not only males, but females as well. So generally speaking, these the research has highlighted can tend to be exposure to abuse, so either emotional, sexual, or physical abuse, but also family dysfunction and neglect plays a role as well. And I just really wanted to flag this because it's really important, because we have to think about it across the spectrum of people who have committed offences, and not just individually. Like, one of the lessons that I've learned over the years of doing work with people who have been convicted of sexual offences is we have often went out of our way to say that they're radically different, not only from us, but from other types of people who offend. And there are differences, but there's a lot of similarities. And you've seen that in the production of Kaizen and Horizon, which is the new, well, I say new, they're about 5 years old now, programs around this which differentiate because of risk level. Now, the important thing about this is there is something in here about attachment. A lot of work in life course criminology and life course psychology as well comes to attachment and inappropriate attachment bonds. And Jill Levinson and Melissa Grady have done work around this. And their work was around people who commit sexual offences. And they argued that, and this is a quote, maltreatment and other adverse experiences disrupt children's socio-emotional development, e.g. their empathy and self-regulation. and their understandings of themselves, i.e. attachment formation, which then puts them at risk for later relationship difficulties and possibly sexual offending. So what they're arguing is that insecure attachment increases criminogenic needs, so risk factors, which puts them more at risk of committing an offence. But I would argue that it's not just sexual offending, that actually an attachment or poor attachment has been shown and has been demonstrated across developmental and life course criminology to impact all types of offending behavior. It maybe plays out more obviously or more concretely in sexual offending or domestic abuse, but actually if you dig into it and you look at the men and women and children that are worked with within the criminal justice frame, there are a lot of attachment issues there, and a lot of cognitive behavioral treatment and therapy and intervention that are done with these individuals is about developing secure and appropriate attachment to not only other people in that interpersonal socio-ecological strand, but also to community and also to society as well. So we just need to take a stopgap here, because what we've been saying up until this point is that people at risk of committing an offence are at risk because of risk factors and protective factors being played out in their lives. And research has shown that the more risk factors you have, the more likely you are to engage in an offence, but also the role that those risk factors play in your socio-development. ACEs, from a health perspective, map on to risk factors from a criminological perspective. And we see that risk factors impact not only individuals who commit an offence, but the broader society as well, and across the offending spectrum. But we have to be cautious about this. So David Finkelhorn, who is a massive researcher in child development and child abuse in the US, starts to caution us, and he says, it's premature to start widespread screening for ACEs in healthcare settings, because we have to answer certain important questions first. So what are effective interventions and responses? So actually, if you're screening for ACEs and you're saying to someone, you've got 4 ACEs, what you're going to do, as soon as you've identified them, you need to have a response to that. So if you're saying to people, your ACEs are risk factors and you're potentially going to be more criminogenic, what's your intervention? How are you going to support them through this? What are the negative outcomes and costs? Prevention is expensive, and prevention often doesn't necessarily give us the return on investment that is easily characterized within funding frames and commissioning frames. So we have to really think through what this is in terms of limited budgets and how we actually deal with these issues, and what should we be screening for. And his article makes some really good insights into this. We don't necessarily have time to go through them all today, but are we thinking about abuse, neglect, family dysfunction? What are the most important ACEs? Are we screening for them all? That if you look from a health perspective at the ACEs screening tool, it screens for them all. But are there certain ACEs that tie to more prolific risk factors from a criminal justice perspective than simply looking at everything and trying to figure out which is the most important? Because when we do that, we can often find things that aren't there. So ACEs and trauma are really important in helping us understand life course criminology and the way that people commit offences and their likelihood or unlikelihood of committing an offence. But if we're going to start using them as a mechanism, we've got to do some work behind the scenes before it gets to the point where they can be rolled out and utilised. So moving into part 3, we're going to start to think now about how we use trauma-informed practice in the community integration of people who have offended. To liven things up, I'm going to have a drink of coffee now instead of water. And a lot of this stuff is going to be a little bit practical and maybe things for you to take away and think about how you can use in your practice, but also thinking about having conversations with people from parallel agencies or across the health criminal justice divide. So this is, I hope, the article that Kate was referring to earlier. This was something that I did for the Inspectorate of Probation, because I had written a chapter that went into an edited collection a few years ago with some colleagues from the third sector, and we talked about ACEs and trauma in the lives of people who had offended. So I was asked to write this. So this is really a short piece. It's about 7 or 8 pages, and it thinks about criminal justice, about how the criminal justice landscape is changing, the importance of taking a person-centered approach, and balancing punishment and rehabilitation. So please do have a look at it. If people want to talk about it or are interested, or even just want to drop me an email, please do. But this is the important thing. I think that people always forget. The role of the criminal justice system, whether it's prison or whether it's probation or whether it's the police, is to punish and rehabilitate. And that rehabilitation becomes important. And we're starting to see the concept of like rehabilitative prisons. So look at the work of people like Nicholas Blagden from Nottingham Trent, who is doing work with HMPPS, thinking about how you create rehabilitative cultures in prisons. So we've got to think about this holistically. So what is trauma-informed care in practice? Well, I love this quote. I use it all the time. And to me, it sums it up in a very clear way. In the simplest terms, the concept of trauma-informed care is straightforward. If professionals were to pause and consider the role of trauma and lingering traumatic stress plays in the lives of an individual, professional, organization, or entire system, would they behave differently? What steps would they take to avoid or at least minimize adding new stress or inadvertently reminding their clients of their past traumas? How can they better help their traumatized clients heal? In effect, by looking at how the entire system is organized and service delivered through a trauma lens, what should be done differently? Now, this is important because if we're saying that trauma and ACEs act as risk factors and play a role in the life and development of people who go on to offend, we have got to recognize the past experiences of those individuals and that individuals are more than their offense, which means that individuals can be dual facing. They can be victims and they can be perpetrators simultaneously. They're not distinct things, which means that although we're doing punishment and rehabilitation with people around the offenses that they've committed, we have to keep in mind the offenses are circumstances that they have been victims of and take that into account in the process. We're seeing trauma-informed approaches everywhere at the minute, both in healthcare settings and education. So we've got to start thinking about how we implement this in criminal justice, which can be a challenge sometimes, because sometimes being trauma-informed and being sympathetic and empathetic to a point can be conflicting, where a lot of professionals may say, yes, but I don't want to be seen as being overly sympathetic or being seen as being manipulated or being seen as not taking the offense seriously. So we've got to think about this coherently. It's really about taking a nurturing approach. And this is something that was done by Education Scotland. It was thinking about youths and young people, but you can see how this all ties together. And really what we're talking about here is being ACEs aware, being aware of the role of brain development and attachment, using that in a trauma-informed way to help people build effective relationships. So again, we're being brought back to that socio-ecological model, aren't we? We're being brought back to individual, interrelationship, societal, and community. And actually building relationships helps with integration. And I think it really plays to the point. Really, what we're doing in developing trauma-informed approaches in criminal justice is building integration. I always have struggled with the concept of reintegration, because reintegration to me is about bringing someone back to a place that they were beforehand. And that's not what we do in criminal justice. We are trying to bring people back to a new place because their lack of integration and their lack of relationships and social and attachment and social functioning helped contribute to their offending behavior. We want to integrate them in a different way, in a nurturing way that actually helps support their desistance in their life, their offense-free lifestyle. So part of this is about understanding the offender as the service user. And this is a piece of work that myself, Daniela Harris from Griffith in Australia, and David Prescott from Safer Society in the US did. And we looked at men convicted of sexual offences and their perspective of the criminal justice system. And what was interesting was there was a lot of conversations about how they felt done to rather than done with. And we often hear this in criminal justice, that actually you will do this program, you will go on this, and we expect people to engage in treatment and rehabilitation and to be motivated to want to do it, but they don't feel that they have choices. They don't feel that they're really a part of it. They think they're part of a system that contributes to it. And it's difficult because you're managing out punishment, rehabilitation, community safety, awareness. There's a lot of other issues that go into it, and it's a controlled framework. But how do we engage and motivate people who have committed offences across the spectrum of offences to rehabilitate, to integrate in a more proactive way? Well, by taking a service user approach. And that is another thing which we have to learn from health and public health. You would not do cancer research or COVID research without engaging with the populations that are going to be using the treatment. Yet we quite often think about treatment as a process that someone goes through, and we don't engage with the population to find out whether their treatment is working for them. Most treatment evaluations are process evaluations. And that becomes important because if we don't understand the impact of rehabilitation and integration on people, how do we know whether it's working? One of the challenges that we have in criminal justice is we have often created a narrative where we see people who have committed an offense as untrustworthy, manipulative, that they'll lie to us, they won't engage with us. And so that raises the question of, do we have to do some thinking around the way that we view the service user and how we engage? And like, I would really recommend you go and look at some of the research that was done around rehabilitative culture, because it's actually starting to frame some of the working within criminal justice in a slightly different way that is more person-centered. So taking a person-centered approach means that we have to understand why people have done things. And one of the most important pieces of work that was being done in criminology and criminal justice in the last few years was by an individual called Shad Maruna. And he basically said, look, you're all asking the wrong questions. Because we were building on a deficit model for generations. And we were saying, how do we stop getting you to do this thing we don't want you to do? We were focusing on the deficits, and we were trying to create the fill in the deficits. where actually he said what you need to do is look at the lives of people who have stopped offending naturally, who have naturally desisted, stopped offending, and to think about why they have stopped offending. So have they aged out of it? Has their relationship status changed? Have they got support? Have they found a different way to think about themselves and their lives? And he said that we need to learn from the experience of people who have stopped offending. So taking that person-centered, that trauma-informed approach and saying, actually, how do we think about this? And that feeds in to something that we see a lot now in criminal justice. So things like the Good Lives model and things like strengths-based approaches. So how do we build upon the strengths that people have to make them realize that they are more than their offense, they are more than the worst thing that they have done, and get them to understand how using the knowledge from building skills and success can be transferred to filling in deficits. So saying things like, yes, you have committed this offense and you need to be held accountable for it. And we need to look at your attachment or your relationships or your dynamic. But actually, you're really good at accountancy. Well, why are you good at accountancy? What skills have you got in developing that we can utilize to work with some of the deficits that you have so that you can upskill your attachment or your relationship status or whatever it happens to be? Which means that we need to look beyond the traditional. So traditionally in criminal justice, we have thought about things from social capital. So being in a network of good people helps promote pro-social modeling, and therefore you're less likely to reoffend. Being around deviant and antisocial people, leads you to offend and increases your risk. However, when you look across the literature, so recovery capital comes from the drugs literature, and a lot of work has been done around it. This is a paper that we have just had accepted and will be coming out later in the month in the Irish Probation Journal, talking about using it as a way to think about people who have committed sexual offences. We have to look at the rounded individual, so their cultural capital, their human capital, their physical capital. So while relationships are important and they can be a risk factor, we have to again return to a person-centered approach. We have to think about the role of not only trauma and ACEs and risk factors, but what some of those protective factors are. So from a cultural capital perspective and a human capital perspective and a physical capital perspective. So again, thinking about the individual as a whole, which then means we have to think through primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, as well as quaternary. And I'm not going to go into these again. This is just a flag to say that by taking a trauma-informed approach, by thinking about the past histories of people who have offended and the impact that these have had on people who have offended, we then can start to think about their journey through the system and ways in which we can prevent and intervene primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary at a individual, interrelationship, community, and social level. So how do we do this? So if we say that, okay, we want to take a person-centered approach, we want to be trauma-informed, sort of what does this look like? So this is from America, and this is from a healthcare perspective, but you can see the similarities within a criminal justice frame about how you avoid trauma both in the system and in relationships within the system. From a systems perspective, constantly retelling their story, telling it to the police, telling it to the lawyers, telling it in court, telling it when they entered the prison system or the probation system, telling it again and again, being treated as a number, disrobing. So that's from a health perspective, but you can also see it upon entry into prison. You can also see it upon engagement with the system, being seen as their label. What we're starting to see now is a movement towards first person language. Certainly in Scotland, they're very proactive around talking about people who have committed an offense or been convicted of an offense. And that sort of reduces the impact of traumatization, but also takes a person-centered approach, because it enables us to say, you are more than your offense. You are you first, and your offense is something that you have done, which we need to work on, but you and your offense are not the same thing. No choice in systems or treatment. Quite often, what you'll find is you'll be put onto this program, and that's that. So, and that can be challenging. And I think we have to think outside of the box on this, because maybe there is no other program for them to go on, or they're not in a place where they can choose the program. But how do we rationalize that and engage them with that? No opportunity to give feedback. Quite often we see people within the criminal justice system who give feedback as being challenging, as being difficult, as being problematic. And yes, sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes we have to be open to hearing feedback and criticism and thinking about our relationships with them in the way that we explain and engage with them. In terms of relationships, they can about not being seen or heard, about trust, about emotional safety, about being collaborative, about things being done to them rather than with them, and the use of language. And language is important, as we have talked about. So you can see actually some of these points playing out in a criminal justice frame the same way as they play out in a health or a psychological frame. So what should we be thinking of? And so this is part of the work that was done on the adversary and trauma-informed principles by the subgroup. There's been a number of separate talks as part of this webinar series on this, and the material is available for people to have a look at. Traditionally, being trauma-informed and using trauma-informed practice generally meant safety, choice, clarity, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment. But the group also felt that inclusivity was massively important, so added it as a sixth factor in this. So being trauma-informed means that you have to engage on these 6 concepts. And what are the benefits of using these 6 concepts as a frame? Well, clients feel safe and supported. They have increased engagement. They understand the symptoms or the risk factors that may be linked to trauma. So actually they realize their pathway through it, which can help in their rehabilitation and reintegration, that their experiences don't create more trauma for them, and it enables them to engage on a recovery journey. For staff, it's a better understanding of individuals' behaviors and actions and the way in which they have behaved. And actually it helps staff understand the roles and contributing factors to offending behavior. Increased compassion, hope and resilience. A reduced impact on stress and burnout. One of the things that we find, not only in criminal justice, but in frontline sectors, is staff dealing with challenging and high-risk individuals get burned out quite quickly, especially with a lot of caseloads to manage. So how do we engage and help staff support their trauma-informed care? So trauma-informed practice isn't just about the clients, it's about the staff group as well. It's a less black and white approach, which I've sort of mentioned. So for agencies, it's a clear framework for their values and philosophy of care, increased staff engagement, reduced illness, and better outcomes. So one of the things that I talk about in the piece that I mentioned at the start of part 3 was how you develop a trauma-informed workforce. And being trauma-informed and using those 6 principles that the subgroup developed means that we have to do it across a range of different levels. I've often heard, oh, I've attended 3-hour training, so I'm now trauma-informed and I'm able to deliver that. Trauma-informed is more than that. It's about having trauma-informed practices in your policies to make them key performance indicators, to make them very real for organizations. It's about in practice. So what are they in practice? How are they in your interventions, in your engagements, and things like that? In place, how is the physical place trauma informed? And people lead by example, have staff being trauma informed. So an interesting piece of work that was done by a colleague of mine in the department was talking about the role of receptionists in HIV and gum clinics, and that actually the one thing that people who attended clinics often said was they would often not go back if they had a poor reception experience. So it's about people, place, practice, and policy. However, community management is more than just that. It's about multi-agency working, which means it's about partners as well. So actually, if your organization and your staff and you are trauma informed, but your multi-agency partners aren't trauma informed, that causes issues. So how do you engage with your partners around this? So a way to think about this is how we use our professional knowledge and value our professional knowledge in being trauma informed. So building upon what our frontline staff know, how their experiences of working with people who have offended influence and drive our understanding of offending behavior, and then increase the likelihood of prevention by redirecting that knowledge upstream in the system so that we can engage in primary and secondary prevention that is informed by tertiary and quaternary prevention and practices. So developing a trauma-informed approach means taking staff with you and taking organizations with you. And actually, and here's some examples. I'm not going to go into great detail about them. You can have a look at them, but it's actually about thinking about screening for trauma in staff, developing safe environments for staff that also enable staff and clients to work together effectively and engaging with your partners. So a lot of what we have talked about, so policy, people, place, practice, and partners are essential for developing a trauma-informed approach. So here's like a bit of a frame that you can start to think about, that actually how does safety fit into your policy? How does it fit into practice? How does empowerment fit into people and partners? Where does inclusivity sit in this? It's a bit of a tick sheet for you to start working through and thinking about the work that you do and how it fits into it. So we're near the end now. A last couple of slides just to think about the context that we're in. So your role, being trauma-informed, is a process, a product, a practice. It's something to be delivered, but it's also something that can be measured. And it should be part of everything that is done within the organization and practice. So here's some considerations. So how do we learn from other organizations? How do we report on trauma-informed practice? Is it in your policies? Is it in your working practices? Is embedded throughout rehabilitation and reintegration processes? But the last thing that I really want to focus on is just to say that we're going through a societal trauma at the minute, and that can't be ignored. People are working from home, they're working in different and challenging situations. They don't have that separation. So we need to start thinking about how do we support staff? How do we support clients in the new normal? How do we make sure that people who have committed offenses get the support in a trauma-informed way that they need to be able to rehabilitate, to move past their past trauma, their past adverse childhood experiences, and live healthy, crime-free lives in an environment that is so radically different from what a lot of us were trained to do, and how we have to think outside of the box around this. And that can lead to innovations, but that also can lead to real questions around it. So thank you. That's me. I know that I've went slightly over, but I'm happy to take questions, and I'm also happy to respond in writing if there's a number of questions, too many in the time that we have. So, Kate.
Hi, Kieran. I hope you can hear me. I've turned my video off in the hope that you can. You've given us so much to think about. I particularly appreciated that about the idea of context and thinking about what's happened to people rather than just what's the matter with them. And that it's not deterministic. The ACEs thing is not about being deterministic. I was talking to an adult with lived experience of mental health service last week, and she said that she hadn't realised that her childhood experiences were trauma, could be defined as trauma, and it had taken her a very, very long time to disclose trauma. I think it was to a therapist, although I rather hope it wasn't. And the therapist said, oh, well, you do know that with your profile, you are likely to offend, you are likely to commit offences. And it took her 2 years to realise that that was not the case. Oops.
What we often know about people who have offended is from people in prison, in probation, and research done around them. And we know that people who have also experienced trauma disclose later in life and they're better able to discuss it, to articulate it. So a lot of the stuff is after the fact, which means that when the trauma is happening and when the ACEs are happening, when we could intervene and do some work before people enter the criminal justice system or become a victim of someone in the criminal justice system, we don't always have that opportunity because we don't learn about the trauma until later on down the line.
Sorry, difficulty unmuting. I'm going to mute you when I speak, Kieran, just for the sound quality. Zoe asked towards the beginning whether you could recap the primary, secondary, tertiary and quaternary, and then she put a subsequent message saying particularly interested because I'm wondering how to engage in secondary and quaternary in youth work practice.
So secondary is working with at-risk populations. So it's working with people who are at risk of committing an offence. So part of it is, how do you identify those people? So is it people maybe in the social care system, maybe in an educational setting, where actually there's concerns around them and a third person says actually they need some help? Or is it people self-referring saying actually I need some help? The difficulty in criminal justice is, how do you do that and how do you recognize that? In health, you would maybe go to your doctor and say, I think I'm drinking too much, or I think I'm eating the wrong foods. But when you start to think about people self-referring, people are less likely to go to the place or to the system and say, I think I'm going to commit an offense. So you've got to think about who identifies those individuals and then what support you have, whether that's an intervention program about getting them to understand their behavior and their engagement, or whether that's about actually getting them to see the problematic nature of what they're doing. So that's some of the stuff around secondary. The quaternary stuff is that broader social support. So in terms of reintegration or integration, what you often have is the system finishes dealing with you when your sentence finishes, but what support is around for people who need that? So is it a local youth group? Is it a local charity that maybe runs a drop-in center that people know that they can go to for that additional level of support to keep them on the straight and narrow, to actually help them reconceptualize their integration and to help them think about how they can navigate some of the issues. Like, so to me, an example of this is something like circles of support and accountability, which actually helps people integrate by pro-social modeling, by offering support, a safe place for them to speak, but also translating aspects of the criminal justice system in a way that people will understand, and they'll understand how not to reoffend or to breach or to be recalled. Hopefully that sort of makes a bit of sense. Like, as I say here, if there are questions, people can, reach out to me on email, and I'm happy to have a separate conversation with people if they don't want to ask the questions in this forum, or they want a greater detail of clarity.
Okay, thank you. Stephen makes a comment, really, a statement, a concern I have that often with the criminal justice system, the focus becomes highly individual with little provision to work with families in the wider system. And also there's a lack of resource to support integration, for example, support through circles or other systems that supports positive engagement in the community and social activities, education. And I'm particularly interested in that, Kieran, because I'm thinking about contextual safeguarding with young people.
No, definitely. And this is the challenge that we have around this, that actually interventions are expensive. We live in what would be characterized as a what works era. So what works with any individual at any given time, but that's expensive. It's bespoke, and it means support and multi-agency working is expensive. But the reality is that actually those are the things that help reduce reoffending and increase interventions and assistance. Now, one of the challenges around this work is actually how you construct it and how you talk about it in a way that is seen as useful. The preventative work is really challenging, because you're saying that if we do this, this will reduce costs further down the line, not only in terms of in terms of victims, in terms of perpetrators, in terms of family support as well. But that can be quite difficult to articulate. The other thing that I would say about the family support is it's massive. Because one of the things that we tend to do in criminal justice is we tend to think about victims and offenders, and that's the way, and that's the words that are used. We don't tend to think about the secondary trauma, that, thinking about things like, if you have a child who has committed an offense, while that child may have ACEs and trauma, the fact that that child is maybe in prison or in a youth detention center or on supervision will have a traumatic effect on the family and the other members of the family as well. So the question is there a way in which services can be provided to help people who have been impacted? And it's quite challenging, it's quite expensive, but I think we really have to think about this. If we don't want to create secondary trauma, just going back to ACEs, they talk about having a parent that's incarcerated. If we don't want that to become a significant ACE, how do we support the family through the incarceration of one of those two parents, so that it doesn't become a risk factor for those children to then go on and commit offences themselves in later life? Maybe having a sibling who's incarcerated, how do we reduce the impact of that? And, it's about one-on-one work. It's about navigating that, but it can be quite expensive. And unfortunately, that's the reality of it. But I think we need to have conversations about how we can fund this in a more effective way, in a more multi-agency way, and a more supportive way. I think I answered the question, but I also think I went on a round the houses journey while I did it.
That was fine. I think that's what we do with this subject. There are two questions here that are quite specific, and it may be that you want to answer these after the session. So Ella F says, I would like to ask a question which is pretty specific to a situation I'm working with that's involving CCE. And then Emily says, are there any tools to use moving forward? So I don't know what you think, Kieran.
Well, the first one I think might be better after the session, and I'm happy to do that. And I would ask for clarity around the second one. The tools for which aspect, I suppose, is my question back.
Emily, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself if you're still here.
Sorry, bear with me if you can hear noise of my daughter in the background. So I've been doing lots of different snippets of trauma-informed training, and I'm just wondering of any tools that are available for any of the trauma bits. So I'm a family support practitioner working with families that have got children under 5.
Okay.
Particularly at the moment, I'm working with a gentleman who's been part of the criminal justice system. He's also involved in lots of mental health services at the moment, which aren't pulling through. The only support that he's got is myself. So anything that I can sort of use with him at the moment, just to get him into some sort of better place, is what I'm asking over all of the training that I'm doing, basically. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks for that, Emily. Yes, there are some tools, generally American in nature, but if you want to email me separately, I can email you back some of that material.
Brilliant, thank you ever so much.
And Emily, I could also email you stuff for early years if you wanted something there as well.
Fantastic.
Okay, brilliant. Ella F says, what's your opinion about moving young people who are offending to a new city or new area? Do you ever think that's an appropriate outcome for the young person, or do you think they should stay in the place where they are offending as their support network is there? And I know Carleen Furman would have a lot to say about that.
Oh yes, and it's going to be interesting to see, because obviously Bristol's becoming a contextual safeguarding pilot area. It's really difficult. It is really difficult, and my view would be that we have to look at the individual, and I know this will sound like a cop-out answer. We need to look at the individual and to think about what actual support works for them. So is it in their best interest to be kept in the same locale, or actually is that making matters significantly worse? Or by moving someone, would that increase their likelihood of desisting and living an offence-free life? And I think this is why risk assessment and risk management plays a central role in this, and professional knowledge plays a central role in this. I think a lot of the time we dismiss professional knowledge and sort of say, actually, you need a tool, and a tool will tell you whether someone's risky or not. Yes, that's important, and we need to do that. But we also need that professional knowledge that says, okay, this is how I think we should proceed with this. So I know it's probably not the answer that you want, but my perspective is always that you need to look at the individual that you're working with and really think about what is in their best interest, because what is in the best interest of one may not be in the best interest of others, and that actually taking a trauma-informed approach means thinking about the individual client. So you may want to move someone from city to city because actually that is in their best interest and that's the best way to engage with them. But actually for another client, you mightn't want to do that because that could be the worst thing that could happen to them.
And very often they gravitate back, don't they, to their own kind of social networks, family and social networks. Roxana says, how does trauma-informed care translate to interagency information sharing in the UK? Do you believe it's a popular trend? Yeah.
So interagency sharing is interesting, to say the least, and it's usually done on a case-by-case basis, and GDPR has thrown up some interesting ways to navigate around it. Do I think that trauma-informed approaches have influenced it? I think they influence individual practitioners, but I don't think that trauma-informed approaches have directly influenced the processes around it. I think what trauma-informed approaches have done is they've said that we need to look at all the information and we need to think about the individual in their context. So it's sort of increased the conversation about really having multi-agency approaches and having informed approaches, but on a purely structural level, I wouldn't say that it has necessarily changed the structure and process of information sharing, but it's changed the perspective of actually we need to have a rounded perspective on this.
Thanks, Kieran. Nikki says, and I should say, Kieran, there are lots of people saying thank you as well. I'm missing those bits out, but I'll show you those later. What are your thoughts on the perspective that many of the interventions carried out in prison are in an environment that continues some of those symptoms of trauma? So often compliance will be a dominant factor. And I guess that's the idea of environments being trauma-inducing rather than trauma-reducing.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with whoever said that. And, you know, having spent time visiting prisons, I often feel annoyed when people tell me that prisons are easy. If you've spent any time in a prison, it's not an easy life and it's not an easy environment, and it's very trauma inducing. We see that there is a high likelihood of mental health problems in prisons. You know, there's a correlation there. We can't say the prison have caused them, but we know that there's a correlation between people who are incarcerated and mental health difficulties. So there's issues at play there. But that's where the work of rehabilitative cultures, whether it's Nick Blagden's work, whether it's the late Ruth Mann's work around it, that actually building a rehabilitative culture in prison is important, because I think that we often forget about that punish and rehabilitate side. We often see rehabilitation maybe something that probation does, or that treatments and intervention providers do. But building a trauma-informed culture in prison means a healthier prison, means a more engaged inmate population and a more informed staff population. So it's really difficult and it's really challenging, but it means that we have to actually throw the concepts out and bring them back in and rebuild. So yeah, prison can be trauma inducing. So I think we have to really think about rehabilitative culture within it, and actually how we can develop a proactive, informed rehabilitative culture that helps people move beyond their offending behavior.
Thank you. Sandy is really asking whether this is a fad, I guess, but what do you think has changed so that trauma and previous life experiences are coming to the fore again? How can we continue to ensure that we do not lose these factors and impact in our own areas of work?
So there's a couple of things I would say about that. I think maybe some of the terminology may be a fad, but we've been doing this work in criminology and criminal justice since the 70s. And you know, life course criminology, development, you know, they're not fads. They're what we have been doing. Now, what has changed is the linking with ACEs. The research in certainly Scotland and Wales that have looked at the impact and outcome of adverse childhood experiences, and that incarceration and offending are outcomes as well as victimization, has allowed us to look at risk factors in criminal justice from a health perspective, which has then enabled us to say that actually crime and criminal justice is a health issue, which we always knew that it was, but it was never characterized as that. And that's what's changed. So the bringing together of conversations around health and justice. So Public Health England and the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice talking together, having coordination around this, that's what's changed. So it's not that the concept of adverse childhood experiences and criminogenic behavior or past trauma is new. It's the linking of justice and health and the light bulb moment that has changed the conversation. And hopefully that will continue to get deeper embedded. And I suppose the challenge is, how do we get England to a place that Wales and Scotland are at around this? And how do we get Northern Ireland to that place as well, where you have it as a sort of a policy level that beyond the postcode lottery that we see in England at the minute around some of these practices.
Yeah, and we've got some really interesting questions here, but we've only got a minute to go. So I think that to do them justice, it would be better to have a written
That's
response,
fine.
if that's okay. So I'm really sorry to those people we haven't answered your questions yet. I wasn't doing any answering, that Kieran hasn't been able to answer your question yet. I know that Bonnie has put the link to the evaluation in the chat, and I'd be really grateful if you would complete those before you leave. But I hope you're joining me in thanking Kieran for a wonderful presentation. It's been so interesting. I used to work in a youth offending team, so I've been kind of thinking about young people as well, and particularly around contextual safeguarding, and I've got a lot to take away, Kieran, so thank you. And I'm sure that everybody else would thank you as well. So thanks to everybody for coming. Please do the evaluation, and we hope to see you later in the week at other sessions. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.